The archive room at Harrow Street. The key turns in the lock, with a sound I've come to know by heart. There's a particular resistance at first, then a soft click, and the door to the archive room opens inward with a faint creak of hinges that have settled into their own rhythm over decades. I step inside and reach for the light switch, though I pause before flipping it, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness that fills this space during the hours when no one else is here. The building around me is silent. It's just past 11 in the evening, and the museum closed its doors to visitors hours ago. The administrative staff left at 5. The security guard, Malcolm, will make his rounds through the main galleries, but he knows I'm here, and he won't disturb me unless something unusual happens. I turn on the lights. The fluorescent tubes flicker for a moment before settling into their steady hum, and the room comes into view exactly as I left it yesterday evening. The archive room is not large, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with tall metal shelving units lining 3 of the walls and a row of filing cabinets against the 4th. There are 2 work tables in the center, their surfaces scarred and marked by years of use. And my desk sits in the corner nearest the door, a small wooden piece with drawers that stick slightly when open. The air smells of old paper, dust, and something else that I've never been able to name precisely. A scent that seems to belong to places where things are kept for a long time without much disturbance. I set my bag down beside the desk and remove my coat, draping it over the back of my chair. The room is cooler than the rest of the building, kept that way deliberately to preserve the material stored here, and I'm glad I wore a sweater. I take a moment to stand still and simply breathe, allowing the transition from the world outside to this particular space. There's always an adjustment period, a settling in, before I can truly begin the work. Tonight, as with most nights over the past several months, I'll be working through the collection of ledgers and logbooks that were donated to the museum last spring by the estate of a woman named Eleanor Ashford. Mrs. Ashford had been a meticulous keeper of records, and her estate included dozens of volumes documenting various aspects of her life and the operations of her family's business, which had been a small printing house operating in the city from the 1870s until the 1950s. The museum accepted the donation because of its potential historical value. But as is often the case, no one had the time to properly catalog or assess the materials when they first arrived. They were placed in storage, and there they sat until I was hired 6 months ago to work through the backlog. I walked to the shelving unit where the Ashford ledgers are kept, all lined up in neat rows on the middle shelf. They vary in size and condition. Some are large, bound in dark leather with brass corners, while others are smaller, more utilitarian, with simple cloth covers. I've been working through them chronologically, starting with the earliest volumes, and I've reached the period covering the early 1900s, a time when the printing house was being run by Eleanor's grandfather, Thomas Ashford. I select the ledger I was examining yesterday, a medium-sized volume bound in dark green cloth with the year 1907 stamped in faded gold on the spine. I carry it carefully to one of the worktables and set it down. Then return to my desk to gather my supplies. A notepad, several pencils, a magnifying glass, a soft brush for removing dust, and a pair of cotton gloves, though I've found that I often work better without them, as they reduce the sensitivity of. I settle into my chair and open the ledger. Pages are thick, slightly yellowed, covered in neat rows of handwriting. Thomas Ashford's hand was precise and steady, the letters formed with care, each entry dated and organized. The ledger records the day-to-day operations of the printing house, Orders received. Jobs completed. Payments made and received. Supplies purchased. It is, on the surface, a mundane document. The kind of record that businesses of all kinds keep out of necessity. But there's something deeply satisfying about working through these entries, about seeing the patterns that emerge, the rhythms of work and commerce, the small details that accumulate over time. I begin where I left off yesterday, in the middle of March, 1907. The entries are straightforward. On March 12th, an order was received from a local church for 500 service programs. On March 13th, Thomas noted the purchase of 3 reams of paper from a supplier whose name is written in a slightly different hand, suggesting that someone else may have made the transaction, and Thomas recorded it later. On March 14th, the church programs were completed and delivered, and payment was received in full. I make notes as I go, recording information that might be useful for creating a catalog entry, or for researchers who might want to access these materials in the future. I note the names of clients, suppliers, employees. I record the types of work the printing house undertook, the prices charged, the materials used. It's slow work, and it requires attention, but it's also deeply calming. There's a rhythm to it, a sense of moving steadily through time. Not my own time, but the time recorded in these pages. Time that has already passed and been fixed in ink. The room is very quiet. The fluorescent lights hum softly above me, and occasionally I hear the faint sound of water moving through pipes in the walls. The building's old plumbing settling. Outside, the city continues its life. But here, in this small room, the world is reduced to the ledger, the table, the light, and the slow passage of my hand across the pages. I work through March and into April. The entries continue in much the same vein. There are orders for wedding invitations, business cards, letterhead, matterhead, pamphlets. There are payments for ink, for paper, for repairs to the printing press. There are wages paid to employees, whose names I've begun to recognize. James Holloway, who seems to have been the primary pressman. Margaret Finch, who handled typesetting. Arthur Dale, whose role is less clear, but who appears frequently in the records. At some point, I realized that I've been working for over an hour, and I decide to take a short break. I stand and stretch, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders and lower back. I walk to the small window set high in the wall near the door. It looks out onto the alley behind the museum, and at this hour, there's nothing to see except the dark shapes of dumpsters and the faint glow of a street light at the far end. I watch for a moment, then return to the table. Before sitting down again, I walk along the shelves, running my fingers lightly over the spines of the other volumes. There are so many of them, not just the Ashford collection, but the accumulated materials from dozens of other donations, acquisitions, transfers. Some of these items have been here for decades, waiting for someone to open them, to read them, to bring them briefly back into the light of attention. It's a strange responsibility, being a curator of these kinds of materials. I'm not discovering anything dramatic or groundbreaking. I'm simply bearing witness to the small, ordinary details of lives that have been lived and concluded. And yet, there's a weight to it, a sense that these details matter. That they deserve to be preserved and acknowledged. I return to my chair and continue reading. April gives way to May, and the entries continue. I notice that the handwriting becomes slightly less consistent toward the end of May, the letters a bit more hurried, the lines less straight. I wonder if Thomas was unwell, or perhaps simply busy. There's no way to know for certain, and the ledger offers no explanation. It simply records the work, day after day, in its steady progression. In early June, there's a notation that catches my attention. It's brief, written in the margin beside an entry for June 7th. Paper delayed. Supplier reports, issue with mill. It's unusual because it's one of the few entries that steps outside the strict format of the ledger to offer a bit of context. A glimpse of something that disrupted the usual routine. I make a note of it and continue reading. The delay seems to have been resolved within a few days, and by mid-June, the entries have returned to their normal pattern. I find myself wondering about the people behind these transactions. The clients who needed their programs and invitations and business cards. The suppliers who provided the materials. The employees who set the type and ran the presses. What were their lives like? What did they think about as they went about their work? Did they imagine that someone, more than a century later, would be sitting in a quiet room, reading the records of their labor? I continue working through June and into July. The nights are long at this time of year, and even though it's well past midnight now, I don't feel particularly tired. This is my preferred time to work, when the building is empty and there are no interruptions, no phones ringing, no colleagues stopping by to ask questions or make small talk. I appreciate the solitude, the sense of being the only person awake and working in this particular corner of the world. July brings a change in the ledger. The entries become more detailed, with additional notes about the quality of paper used, the specific type of ink, the exact dimensions of the finished products. I suspect this was related to a particular client or project that required extra care and documentation. There's an entry on July 23rd for a commission from a local theater, a large order for playbills and posters. And the notes indicate that Thomas consulted with the theater's manager several times to ensure the design and printing met their specifications. I lean back in my chair and consider the ledger. It's easy to think of these documents as dry, purely functional records, but as I work through them, I'm struck by how much personality emerges. Even in the most mundane entries, Thomas Ashford was a careful, methodical person. Someone who took pride in his work and wanted to ensure that everything was done correctly. That much is clear from the precision of his handwriting, the thoroughness of his notes, the attention to detail in even the smallest transactions. I glance at the clock on the wall. It's nearly 1 in the morning. I should probably eat something. But I'm not particularly hungry, and I'm reluctant to break my concentration. Instead, I stand and walk to the small table near the door where I've set up a kettle and a few supplies for making tea. I fill the kettle from the small sink in the corner and set it to boil. Then select a tea bag from the tin I keep here. The kettle begins to heat, and I stand waiting, listening to the faint sound of the water beginning to move and shift as it warms. The tea is ready within a few minutes, and I carry the cup back to my desk. The warmth of the cup in my hands is pleasant, and I take a sip, then set it down beside the ledger. I turn the page and continue reading. August arrives, and the entries continue. There's a rhythm to the work now. Familiarity with Thomas's handwriting, and the structure of his records that allows me to move more quickly. I can anticipate the kinds of information he'll include, the way he'll format each entry, the occasional marginal note that offers a bit of additional context. In mid-August, there's an entry that mentions a new employee, a young man named Peter Whitmore, who was hired as an assistant pressman. His wages are listed, and there are several subsequent entries documenting his work on various projects. I add his name to my list and make a note to see if he appears in later volumes as well. The work continues, steady and unhurried. I finish my tea and set the cup aside. The lights hum above me, and the building is silent except for the occasional creak and settling of old wood and stone. I've grown accustomed to these sounds, and they no longer distract me. If anything, they've become part of the atmosphere of this room, part of the experience of being here at night, alone with these records. September comes and the entries begin to reflect the changing season. There are orders for school supplies, for calendars and appointment books for the coming year, for holiday cards and seasonal advertising materials. The printing house seems to have been busy during this time, and Thomas's entries become slightly more compressed, as if he was working quickly to keep up with the volume of business. I continue reading, making my notes, occasionally pausing to examine a particularly interesting entry, or to check a detail in my previous notes. The hours pass without my noticing. This is one of the things I appreciate most about this work, the way it allows me to lose myself in the process, to become absorbed in the steady accumulation of detail, the slow unfolding of time as recorded in these pages. October arrives, and the entries continue. I notice that Thomas has begun to include more information about the weather, brief notes at the bottom of each page. Rain all day, first frost last night, clear and cold. I find these notes touching, evidence of Thomas's awareness of the world beyond the walls of his printing house. His attention to the rhythms of the natural world, even as he focused on the demands of his business. By 2 a.m, I've worked through October and into November. My back is beginning to ache from sitting. I stand and walk slowly around the room, stretching my arms and shoulders. I stop at the window again and look out into the alley. The street light at the far end is still glowing, casting a pool of orange light on the pavement. Everything else is dark and still. I think about Malcolm, the security guard, somewhere in the building making his rounds. I wonder if he ever gets lonely, walking through the empty galleries at night, surrounded by artifacts and displays, but no people. We've spoken a few times, usually when he stops by the archive room to check on me, and he seems like a thoughtful person, someone who takes his work seriously, but doesn't let it weigh on him unduly. I return to the table and sit down again. I open the ledger to where I left off and continue reading. November unfolds in its entries. The days growing shorter, the weather colder. There are orders for holiday materials, for cards and calendars and special promotions. The printing house seems to have been preparing for a busy season, and Thomas's notes reflect the increased activity. In late November, there's an entry that mentions a delay in receiving a shipment of ink. Thomas notes that he contacted the supplier and was assured the shipment would arrive within a few days. The entry is matter of fact, with no indication of frustration or concern, just a simple recording of the situation. It arrives in the expected time frame, and the work continues. December begins, and the entries take on a slightly different quality. There are more personal notes, brief mentions of preparations for the holidays, references to family gatherings and seasonal traditions. Thomas records the purchase of a small gift for each of his employees, a tradition that seems to have been established practice. The gifts are modest, a few dollars in value, but the fact that he recorded them suggests they were important to him, a way of acknowledging the work and loyalty of the people who helped run his business. I find myself moved by these small gestures, these glimpses of care and consideration embedded in the ledger's otherwise business-like entries. It's a reminder that even in those routine and transactional aspects of life, there's room for kindness, for attention to the human dimensions of work and relationships. The year draws to a close, and the final entries of 1907 are brief summaries of the year's business, tallies of income and expenses, notes about inventory and supplies on hand. Thomas's handwriting is as steady and precise as ever. And the final entry, dated December 31st, simply states, year concluded. All accounts settled. Wow. I close the ledger and sit for a moment, feeling the satisfaction of having completed another volume. It's a small accomplishment, perhaps, but it's meaningful to me. Each ledger represents a portion of time, a slice of someone's life, and working through it is a way of honoring that time, of ensuring that it isn't lost or forgotten. I stand and carry the ledger back to the shelf, placing it carefully in its spot. I select the next volume, the one covering 1908, and carry it to the table. Before opening it, I make another cup of tea and take a few minutes to rest my eyes, looking around the room and appreciating the quiet. The new ledger is similar in size and format to the previous one, bound in dark blue cloth, with the year stamped on the spine. I open it and begin reading. The first entry is dated January 2nd, 1908, and it records the resumption of work after the New Year's holiday. Thomas notes that the shop was closed on January 1st, and that work began again on the 2nd with several orders that had been placed before the holiday. I settle into the rhythm of reading once more, making my notes, recording the details. January unfolds, cold and busy, with orders for business forms and stationery, for announcements and invitations. The entries are familiar by now, the patterns established, and I find comfort in the continuity. The sense that life in the printing house continued much as it had in the previous year. There's an entry in mid-January that mentions Peter Whitmore, the young assistant pressman who was hired in August of the previous year. Thomas notes that Peter has shown considerable skill and is being given more responsibility in operating the press. It's a small promotion, perhaps, but it's documented with care, suggesting that Thomas valued the development of his employees, that he paid attention to their progress and growth. February arrives, and the entries continue. The weather notes become more frequent, with Thomas recording snowstorms and freezing temperatures. There are occasional delays in deliveries and shipments due to the weather, but nothing that seems to have seriously disrupted the work. The printing house appears to have been well prepared for winter, with adequate supplies on hand to weather any temporary interruptions. I continue reading through February and into March. The work is steady, the entries routine. There's something deeply satisfying about this predictability, this sense of time passing in its measured way, marked by the regular activities of work and business. I'm aware that many people would find this material tedious, that the lack of drama or excitement would bore them, but I've always been drawn to exactly these kinds of documents, these records of ordinary life unfolding day by day. By 3 in the morning, I've worked through March and into April of 1908. My tea has gone cold, and I set it aside. I stand and stretch, then walk to the filing cabinets along the wall. I'm thinking about the broader context of the Ashford collection, about the other materials that were donated along with the ledgers. There are letters, photographs, personal documents. I've only begun to explore them, and I know that a fuller understanding of the printing house and the Ashford family will require looking at all of these materials together, seeing how they relate and inform one another. But that work will come later. For now, I'm content to focus on the ledgers, to work through them systematically, year by year, allowing the story of the printing house to unfold at its own pace. There's no rush, no deadline pressing on me. This is work that requires patience and attention, and I have both in abundance during these quiet nights. I return to the table and continue reading. April gives way to May, and the entries continue in their steady progression. There are orders for graduation announcements and programs, for wedding invitations, for business materials of all kinds. The printing house seems to have been thriving, and Thomas's records reflect a growing business, with more orders, more employees, more supplies purchased. In late May, there's an entry that mentions the purchase of a new printing press, a significant investment that Thomas records with careful detail. He notes the make and model of the press, the price paid, the terms of payment. There are several subsequent entries documenting the installation of the press, the training of employees in its operation, the first jobs printed using the new equipment. It's clear that this was an important moment in the life of the business, a step forward, an expansion of capacity and capability. I make extensive notes about this development, knowing that it will be significant for anyone researching the history of the printing house. The purchase of new equipment, the investment in growth, the confidence that such decisions reflect. These are all important aspects of understanding how the business operated and evolved over time. June arrives, and the entries begin to mention the new press regularly. Jobs are being completed more quickly, with higher quality results. Thomas records the satisfaction of several clients, noting that they were pleased with the work and have placed additional orders. There's a sense of pride in these entries, a satisfaction with the progress being made. I continue reading through June and into July. The nights are long at this time of year, and even though it's now past 3:30 in the morning, the darkness outside the window hasn't begun to lighten yet. I know that dawn won't come for another few hours, and I'm content to continue working until then, or until I feel the need for rest. July brings more of the same steady work, the regular rhythm of orders and production, payments and purchases. There are entries documenting repairs to the old press, maintenance work that was necessary to keep it running smoothly. There are entries about new clients, new relationships being established, new opportunities being pursued. Thomas's handwriting continues steady and clear, his notes precise and thorough. In mid-July, there's an entry that mentions Margaret Finch, the typesetter. Thomas notes that she has been with the printing house for 15 years, and that in recognition of her long service and excellent work, her wages are being increased. It's a brief entry, but it speaks to the kind of employer Thomas was, someone who valued loyalty and skill, who was willing to invest in the people who worked for him. I think about Margaret Finch, imagining her at work, setting type letter by letter, line by line, creating the forms that would be used to print all manner of documents. It was painstaking work, requiring precision and patience, and I wonder what her life was like outside the printing house, what she thought about as she worked, whether she found satisfaction in her craft. August arrives, and the entries continue. There's a note about the weather being particularly hot, with Thomas recording several days where the heat made work in the shop uncomfortable. He notes that the employees were given extra breaks and that work hours were adjusted slightly to avoid the hottest part of the afternoon. It's another small gesture of care, another indication that Thomas was attentive to the well-being of the people who worked for him. I continue reading through August and into September. The rhythm of the work is deeply familiar now, and I move through the entries with practiced efficiency, extracting the relevant information, making my notes, building up the record that will eventually become the catalog entry for this volume. September brings the usual seasonal shift, with orders for school-related materials, for calendars and planners, for holiday preparations that were beginning even in early autumn. The printing house seems to have been well-positioned to meet these demands, and Thomas's notes reflect a busy but manageable workload. By 4 in the morning, I've worked through September and into October. I'm beginning to feel the first signs of fatigue, a slight heaviness in my eyes, a sense that my concentration is not quite as sharp as it was earlier. But I want to finish this volume, or at least get close to finishing it, before I stop for the night. October unfolds in the ledger, the days growing shorter, the weather cooling. There are the usual notes about rain and wind, about the first frosts and the changing leaves. Thomas's observations of the natural world continue to appear at the bottom of the pages, brief notes that ground the business records in the larger rhythms of the seasons. In late October, there's an entry about a problem with the new press, a mechanical issue that required repairs. Thomas records the details of the problem, the time it took to fix it, the cost of the repairs. He notes that the press was out of commission for 3 days, and that work had to be shifted to the older equipment during that time. It's the kind of challenge that any business faces. And Thomas's matter-of-fact recording of it suggests that he took such difficulties in stride, managing them as they arose without undue distress. November arrives, and the entries reflect the approach of winter and the holiday season. There are orders for Thanksgiving materials, for Christmas cards and calendars, for all the printed goods that businesses and individuals need at this time of year. The printing house seems to have been busy, and Thomas's entries become slightly more compressed, with less detail about individual jobs and more focus on the overall flow of work. I continue reading, making my notes, tracking the progress of the year. November gives way to December, and the entries take on that familiar end-of-year quality, with summaries and tallies, with notes about inventory and plans for the coming year. The final entries of 1908 are brief. Thomas records the completion of the year's work, the settlement of all accounts, the preparations for the New Year's holiday. The last entry, dated December 31st, simply states, "All accounts in order, looking ahead to 1909 with confidence." I close the ledger and sit back in my chair. The sense of satisfaction is even stronger this time. Perhaps because I've now completed 2 full years of records. Or perhaps simply because I'm tired and ready to rest. I glance at the clock and see that it's nearly 4:30 in the morning. The night is beginning to wind down, though dawn is still a ways off. I stand and carry the ledger back to the shelf, placing it beside the previous volume. I look at the remaining ledgers, the years that still need to be read and cataloged. There are so many of them, stretching forward through the decades, documenting the continued life of the printing house through times of change and growth, through challenges and successes, through all the ordinary days that accumulate to form a life, a business, a history. But that work will wait. For now, I need to rest. I gather my notes and organize them into a neat stack, which I place in one of the desk drawers. I rinse out my teacup at the sink and set it to dry. I turn off the desk lamp and then walk to the door, pausing to look back at the room before turning off the overhead lights. The room returns to darkness. And I step into the hallway. Unlocking it. The building is still silent, still empty, except for Malcolm somewhere making his rounds. I walk slowly down the hallway toward the staff exit, my footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet. Outside, the air is cool and fresh, a relief after the hours spent in the climate-controlled archive room. The sky is still dark, but there's a sense that dawn is approaching, a subtle lightening at the eastern horizon. I stand for a moment, breathing the night air, feeling the transition from the interior world of the archive to the exterior world of the city. I walk to my car and drive home through streets that are nearly empty. The city is still asleep, and I feel a sense of peaceful solitude, a connection to all the other people who work through the night in various capacities, keeping the world running while most people rest. At home, I make a light meal, and then go to bed, falling asleep quickly, my mind still full of ledger entries and handwritten notes, of the steady rhythm of Thomas Ashford's record-keeping, of the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The following evening, I return to the archive room. The routine is the same. The key in the lock, the lights flickering on, the familiar smell of old paper and dust. I settle in at my desk and retrieve the next ledger from the shelf. The volume covering 19. This ledger is slightly larger than the previous two, bound in dark brown leather with brass corners. The spine is worn, suggesting that it was handled more frequently than some of the others. Perhaps because it was kept on Thomas's desk for easy reference throughout the year. I carry it to the work table and open it carefully. The first entry is dated January 4th, 1909. Thomas notes that the shop was closed for the first 3 days of the new year, allowing employees time to celebrate and rest with their families. Work resumed on the 4th, with several orders that had accumulated during the holiday period. I begin reading, falling once more into the rhythm of the work. The entries are familiar, the patterns well established. There are orders and payments, supplies and wages. The daily business of the printing house unfolding in Thomas's careful handwriting. January proceeds through its cold days, and I note the weather observations that Thomas continues to record. There are several significant snowstorms, and he notes delays in deliveries and difficulties with transportation, but nothing that seriously disrupts the work. In late January, there's an entry that catches my attention. Thomas records a visit from a representative of a larger printing company based in another city. The representative apparently expressed interest in purchasing the Ashford printing house, offering what Thomas describes as a substantial sum. Thomas's response is recorded simply, declined. This business is my life's work and will remain in family hands. I find this entry fascinating, both for what it reveals about Thomas's commitment to his business and for the glimpse it provides into the larger industrial context of the time. Consolidation and acquisition were becoming more common in many industries, and it seems the printing business was no exception. Thomas's decision to maintain independence, to resist the offer no matter how attractive financially, speaks to his values and his vision for the future. I make extensive notes about this entry, knowing it will be important for understanding the trajectory of the business and the choices that shaped its development. I wonder what Eleanor Ashford, Thomas's granddaughter, thought about this decision when she eventually inherited the business. Did she see it as wise, as preserving something valuable? Or did she sometimes wonder what might have been different if Thomas had accepted the offer? February arrives, and the entries return to their usual focus on the day-to-day operations of the business. There are orders for Valentine's Day cards and materials for business forms and letterhead, for all the printed goods that kept the presses running and the employees working. I noticed that Peter Whitmore's name appears more frequently in the entries now. He seems to have taken on additional responsibilities, and Thomas occasionally notes that Peter supervised certain jobs or handled specific client consultations. It appears that Peter was being groomed for a larger role in the business, perhaps as a future manager or partner. March comes, and I continue reading through the entries. The work is steady, the rhythm unbroken. There's something meditative about this process, something that allows my mind to settle and focus in a way that's increasingly rare in the modern world. I'm grateful for these hours, for the opportunity to slow down, pay attention to the small details, the accumulated evidence of lives lived with care and intention. In mid-March, there's an entry about repairs to the building that housed the printing house. Thomas records that the roof needed patching, that there were issues with the plumbing, that the windows in the front office needed to be replaced. The expenses are listed in detail, and Thomas notes that the work was completed over the course of a week, with minimal disruption to the business operations. April arrives, bringing its usual seasonal business. There are orders for Easter materials, for spring cleaning advertisements, for all the printed goods associated with renewal and new beginnings. Thomas's entries reflect a busy time, and I can sense the energy and activity that must have filled the printing house during these weeks. By midnight, I've worked through April and into May. I take a break to make tea and stretch my legs, walking around the room and looking at the various materials stored on the shelves. There's so much here, so many stories waiting to be discovered, so much evidence of lives and work and effort that deserves to be remembered and honored. I return to the ledger and continue reading. May unfolds with its orders for graduation materials, for wedding invitations, for business promotions tied to the coming summer season. The printing house seems to have been operating at full capacity, and Thomas's notes reflect a satisfaction with the volume and quality of work being produced. In late May, there's an entry that mentions Margaret Finch again. Thomas notes that she has been unwell and has taken several days off to recover. He records that her wages were paid in full despite the absence, and that he sent a basket of fruit to her home with his wishes for her speedy recovery. It's another small gesture that reveals Thomas's character, his care for the people who worked with him. June arrives, and the entries continue in their steady progression. I'm aware that I've been working for several hours now, that it's well past midnight, but I'm not ready to stop. There's something compelling about this material, about the way it reveals the texture of daily life in a different era, about the connections it creates across time between Thomas Ashford, sitting at his desk in the early 1900s, and me, sitting at my work table in the present day. July brings entries about the summer heat, about adjustments made to work schedules to accommodate the weather, about supplies of ice water kept available for the employees. Thomas notes that production slowed slightly during the hottest weeks, but that the quality of work remained high. In mid-July, there's an entry about a significant order from a publishing house, a contract to print several hundred copies of a small book. Thomas records the details of the contract, the terms of payment, the timeline for completion. But he notes that this is the first book-length project the printing house has undertaken, and that special care will be required to ensure the quality meets the publisher's standards. I find this development interesting, a sign that the printing house was expanding its capabilities and taking on more complex and challenging work. I make extensive notes about the project, and I look ahead through the ledger to track its progress. The entries over the following weeks document the work on the book project. Thomas records the stages of production, the setting of type, the creation of the printing plates, the actual press runs, the binding and finishing. He notes challenges that arose and how they were resolved. He records consultations with the publisher's representative, adjustments made to meet their requirements, the satisfaction expressed when the finished books were delivered. August arrives, and the book project is completed successfully. Thomas records the final payment received, and he notes that the publisher has expressed interest in working with the printing house on future projects. There's a sense of pride and accomplishment in these entries, a recognition that the business had reached a new level of capability. I continue reading through August and into September. The rhythm of the work remains steady, and I move through the entries with practiced efficiency. September brings its usual seasonal shift, with orders for school materials and autumn promotions, with preparations for the coming holiday season. By 2 a.m, I've reached October in the ledger. My eyes are beginning to feel tired, and I know I should probably stop soon. But I want to push through at least a bit further, to reach some natural stopping point in the year's progression. October unfolds with its entries about cooling weather and changing leaves, about orders for Thanksgiving materials and Christmas preparation. There's an entry in mid-October that mentions James Holloway, the pressman, celebrating 20 years with the printing house. Thomas records that a small gathering was held to mark the occasion. And that James was given a bonus in recognition of his long and faithful service. November arrives, and the entries reflect the busy pre-holiday period. The printing house seems to have been operating at full capacity, and Thomas's entries become more compressed, with less detail about individual jobs and more focus on managing the overall flow of work. In late November, there's an entry that gives me pause. Thomas records that Arthur Dale, one of the employees I've seen mentioned frequently throughout the ledgers, has decided to leave the printing house to pursue other opportunities. Thomas's entry is gracious, thanking Arthur for his service and wishing him well. But there's something in the brief phrasing that suggests regret, a sense of loss at the departure of a valued colleague. December comes, and the entries continue through the busy holiday season. There are orders for Christmas cards and New Year's calendars, for business promotions and seasonal advertising. The printing house seems to have been working at full capacity, meeting the demands of the busiest time of the year. The final entries of 1909 are similar to those of Continued Act 29. 2025 previous years. Summaries of the year's business, tallies of income and expenses, notes about inventory and preparations for the coming year. The last entry, dated December 31st, reads, "Year concluded. Much accomplished. Looking ahead to 1910 with gratitude and determination." Okay. I close the ledger and sit quietly for a moment. There's something moving about these year-end entries, of Thomas's practice of taking stock, of acknowledging the work done and looking ahead with purpose and hope. It's a reminder of the human dimension of these records, of the person behind the careful handwriting and meticulous documentation. I stand and stretch, feeling the stiffness in my back and shoulders. It's nearly 3 in the morning now, and I've been sitting for hours. I walk slowly around the room, letting my body adjust, feeling the blood flow return to my legs. I think about the ledger I've just completed, about the year it documents, about the patterns and rhythms that have emerged from the entries. 1909 was a year of growth for the printing house. A year of new challenges met, and new capabilities developed. It was also a year of continuity, of the steady work that sustained the business and the people who depended on it. I return to the shelf and place the ledger in its spot. I look at the next volume, the one covering 1910, and I'm tempted to begin it. But I know I need to rest. The work will be here tomorrow night, and the night after that, and for as many nights as it takes to work through the entire collection. I gather my notes and organize them, adding them to the growing file I'm building on the Ashford collection. I rinse my teacup and prepare to leave, but before I do, I take a moment to simply stand in the center of the room and appreciate the space, the shelves full of materials, the quiet that allows this work to happen. I turn off the lights and step into the hallway, locking the door behind me. The building is silent and I walk slowly toward the exit, my mind full of the entries I've read, of Thomas Ashford's careful record-keeping, of the printing house and its steady work through the years. Outside, the night is clear and cold. The stars are visible above the city lights, and I stand for a moment looking up at them, feeling small and connected, part of the vast progression of time that the ledgers document in their own way. I drive home through the quiet streets, grateful for the work, grateful for the opportunity to spend these hours with the records of lives lived with care and attention, grateful for the small role I play in preserving and honoring that work. The next evening, I return once more to the archive room. The routine is deeply familiar now, comfortable in its predictability. I settle in and retrieve the ledger covering 1910, a volume bound in dark red cloth with simple gold lettering on the spine. I open the ledger and begin reading. The first entry is dated January 3rd, 1910, and it records the resumption of work after the New Year's holiday. Thomas notes that the shop received several new orders during the first week of the year, a promising start to the decade. I settle into the rhythm of reading, making my notes, tracking the flow of business through January. The entries are familiar by now, the patterns well established. There are orders and payments, supplies and wages, the regular rhythm of work that sustain the printing house and the people who work there. In mid-January, there's an entry about the hiring of a new employee to replace Arthur Dale, who had left at the end of the previous year. The new employee is named Robert Chen, and Thomas notes that he comes with good references and previous experience in printing work. His starting wages are recorded, and there are subsequent entries documenting his integration into the work of the shop. February arrives, bringing its usual cold weather and orders for Valentine's materials. Thomas's weather notes become more frequent again, recording snowstorms and freezing temperatures, noting occasional delays but also the resilience and commitment of the employees, who continued their work despite the difficulties. I continue reading through February and into March. The ledger unfolds in its steady way, revealing the daily life of the printing house through the careful documentation of orders and expenses, of work completed and payments received. In late March, there's an entry that mentions a problem with one of the presses. Thomas records that the machine developed a mechanical issue that required specialized repair work. He notes that a technician was brought in from another city, that the repairs took several days, and that the cost was substantial. But he also notes that the press was restored to full working order, and that the investment was necessary to maintain the quality and capacity of the business. April comes, and the entries reflect the usual spring business. There are orders for Easter materials, for business forms and stationery, for all the printed goods needed by individuals and businesses at this time of year. The printing house seems to have been busy, and Thomas's entries suggest a steady flow of work. By midnight, I've worked through April and into May. I pause to make tea and take a short break, walking around the room and thinking about the material I'm reading. There's a cumulative effect to working through these ledgers chronologically. A sense of watching time unfold year by year, of seeing the patterns and rhythms that shape the life of the business and the people connected to it. May unfolds with its orders for graduation materials and wedding invitations, and I continue making my notes, tracking the details that will eventually form the catalog entry for this volume. The work is absorbing, and I find that hours pass without my awareness, marked only by the progression of entries in the ledger. In early June, there's an entry about Peter Whitmore, the young pressman who has appeared frequently in previous ledgers. Thomas records that Peter has been with the printing house for nearly 2 years now, and that his skill and dedication have been exemplary. Thomas notes that Peter's wages are being increased significantly, and that he is being given the title of assistant manager, with expanded responsibilities for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the shop. This promotion is significant, and I make extensive notes about it. It suggests that Thomas was thinking about succession, about ensuring the continuity of the business beyond his own involvement. It also speaks to Thomas's commitment to developing the talents of his employees, to creating opportunities for growth and advancement. July arrives, and the entries continue. There are notes about the summer heat, about adjustments to the work schedule, about efforts to keep the shop comfortable for the employees. Thomas records the purchase of several electric fans, a modern innovation that he notes has made a significant difference in the working conditions. In mid-July, there's an entry about another book printing project, this time a more ambitious undertaking than the previous one. Thomas records that a local author has commissioned the printing house to produce a limited edition of his poetry collection, a project that will require careful attention to design and quality. Thomas notes that Peter Whitmore will be overseeing this project, a sign of the confidence Thomas has in his young assistant manager. Her retirement marks a significant transition, the end of an era in some small way, and Thomas's acknowledgement of her contribution is touching in its sincerity. November arrives, and the entries reflect the busy pre-holiday period. The printing house seems to have been operating at full capacity once again. And Thomas's notes suggest a steady flow of orders and work. There are entries about hiring a temporary worker to help with the increased volume, about overtime hours worked by the regular employees, about efforts to meet all the commitments and deadlines. December comes, and the entries continue through the holiday season. There are orders for Christmas cards and New Year's materials, for business promotions, and seasonal advertising. Thomas records a small gathering held at the shop to mark Margaret Finch's retirement, noting that she was given a gift and that several employees spoke in appreciation of her work and friendship. The year draws to a close, and the final entries are the familiar summaries and tallies, the year-end accounting, and the last entry, dated December 31st, 1910, reads, "Year concluded. Much change, much accomplished. Looking ahead to 1911 with hope and purpose." I close the ledger and sit quietly. It's past 3 in the morning now, and I'm beginning to feel the accumulated tiredness of these long nights of work. But there's also a deep satisfaction, a sense that I'm engaged in work that matters, that contributes something valuable, even if in a small way. I stand and carry the ledger back to the shelf, placing it carefully beside the previous volumes. I look at the remaining ledgers stretching along the shelf, knowing that each one contains its own story, its own documentation of time passing and work being done, of lives being lived with care and intention. I gather my notes and prepare to leave. But before I do, take a moment to simply be present in the room, to appreciate the quiet and the sense of connection I feel to the materials stored here, to the people whose work created these records, to the effort required to preserve and honor that work. I turn off the lights and step into the hallway, locking the door behind me. The building is silent around me, and I walk slowly toward the exit, my mind full of the entries I've read tonight, of Thomas Ashford's steady documentation, of the printing house and its work through another year. Outside, the night air is crisp and clear. I stand for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the transition from the interior world of the archive to the exterior world of the city. The streets are quiet, nearly empty. I walk to my car feeling peaceful and centered. I drive home through the darkness, thinking about the work ahead, about the ledgers still waiting to be read, about the story that's emerging from these careful records. It's a quiet story, perhaps, a story of ordinary work and ordinary lives, but it's a story that deserves to be told, that needs to be preserved and made available for future generations who might want to understand how people lived and worked in earlier times. At home, I prepare for bed, my mind still occupied with ledger entries and handwritten notes, with the rhythm of work that spans decades and connects past to present. I fall asleep, thinking about Thomas Ashford in his printing house, about the careful way he documented his work, about the legacy he created through his attention and dedication. The pattern continues over the following weeks. Each evening, I return to the archive room and work through another ledger, moving steadily forward through the years. The decades unfold in their entries, revealing the continued life of the printing house through times of change and stability, challenge and growth. 1911 brings entries about new equipment and expanding capacity. 1912 documents the challenges of a difficult economy and the efforts required to maintain the business through lean times. "1913 records recovery and renewed growth, with new clients and expanding opportunities. The years progress, each one documented in Thomas's careful handwriting. Each ledger a testament to his commitment to recording the work of his life. I work through the teens and into the 20s, watching the business evolve and adapt to changing times and circumstances. Peter Whitmore's name appears more and more frequently. And by the early 1920s, he seems to have become Thomas's full partner in managing the business. The entries begin to be written in different hands, with Peter sometimes making the daily entries and Thomas adding notes and summaries at week's end or month's end. The printing house continues its work through the 1920s and into the Depression years of the 1930s. The ledgers from this period reflect the difficulties of those times, the reduced orders and tightened budgets, the challenges of keeping the business viable. But they also reflect resilience and determination, a refusal to give up, a commitment to weathering the difficulties and continuing the work. Thomas Ashford's handwriting becomes less frequent in the ledgers of the late 1930s, appearing mainly for significant entries and year-end summaries. Peter Whitmore seems to have taken over most of the daily record-keeping, and his hand is steady and clear, following the patterns and practices established by Thomas. In 1940, there's an entry that marks a significant transition. Thomas records that he is stepping back from active management of the printing house, that Peter Whitmore is assuming full control of daily operations, that Thomas will remain available for consultation but trusts Peter completely to carry the business forward. The entry is brief and factual, but I sense the emotion behind it, the significance of this moment for Thomas. He had built this business from nothing, had devoted his life to its success, and now he was entrusting it to someone else, confident that the work would continue, that the values and standards he had established would be maintained. The ledgers of the 1940s document the printing house under Peter's management. The handwriting is exclusively his now, and the entries maintain the careful attention to detail that Thomas had established. The business continues through the war years and into the post-war period, adapting to changing technologies and markets, maintaining its place in the community's commercial life. In 1948, there's a brief entry noting Thomas Ashford's death. Peter records it simply. Thomas Ashford passed away peacefully at his home on March 12, 1948. He was 78 years old. The business he built will continue as his legacy, and his principles will guide our work always. I sit for a long time after reading this entry, feeling the weight of the moment, the end of a life that I've come to know through these careful records. Thomas Ashford was real to me now in a way he hadn't been when I first opened the ledgers months ago. I'd spent so many hours reading his entries, following the daily work of his life, seeing the care and attention he brought to everything he did. And now his story had reached its end, documented in a single brief entry in the continuing record of the business he'd created. The ledgers continue through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Peter Whitmore maintains the business with the same care and attention that Thomas had shown, and the printing house continues its work. But the entries begin to reflect the changing times, the increasing competition from larger printing operations, the challenges of maintaining an independent business in an industry undergoing consolidation. The final ledger in the collection covers 1952 to 1954. The entries become less frequent toward the end, and there's a sense of winding down, of a business approaching its conclusion. In the final entry, dated November 15th, 1954, Peter records that the printing house is being closed, that the equipment is being sold, that the business that Thomas Ashford built and maintained for more than 50 years has reached its end. He concludes, "We did good work here for a long time. That's something to be proud of and grateful for." I close the final ledger and sit in the quiet of the archive room. It's nearly 4 in the morning, and I've just completed the last volume of the Ashford collection, reaching the end of a journey that has taken months of careful reading and documentation. I feel a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, grateful to have done this work, to have honored these records and the people who created them, but also aware of the loss, the ending of something that once mattered deeply to the people involved. I stand and carry the ledger back to the shelf, placing it beside all the others. The complete set now fully read and documented. I look at them arranged in their chronological order, spanning more than 40 years of careful record keeping. And I feel a deep respect for Thomas Ashford and Peter Whitmore and all the others whose work created these materials. The catalog entries I've been creating will make this collection accessible to researchers, will allow future scholars to explore the history of the printing house and the lives of the people connected to it. But I know that what I've gained from this work goes beyond the professional task of cataloging and preservation. I've been given the gift of time spent with these careful records, the opportunity to witness lives lived with dedication and purpose, to see the small daily choices that accumulate over time, to create a legacy worth remembering. I gather my notes for the final time, organizing them into the comprehensive file I've built over these months. I make my final cup of tea and sit at my desk, thinking about the work ahead, about the catalog entries that still need to be written, about the other collections waiting for attention. But for tonight, I'm content to simply sit in the quiet, surrounded by these materials, grateful for the opportunity to do this work, to serve as a bridge between past and present, to help ensure that the careful record-keeping of people like Thomas Ashford isn't lost or forgotten, but preserved. Anyone who wants to understand. The night continues around me, the building silent, the city quiet in these hours before dawn. I sip my tea and think about Thomas at his desk in the printing house. Making his careful entries, documenting his work day by day. I think about Peter taking over that work, maintaining those standards, continuing the tradition of careful record-keeping even as the world changed around him. And I think about my own work, the quiet hours spent in this archive room, the steady progression through these materials, the attention required to do the work well. There's a continuity here, a connection across time, a shared commitment to preserving and honoring the details of work and life that might otherwise be lost. The clock on the wall shows that it's past 4:30 now. Dawn is still a ways off, but the night is beginning its slow transition toward morning. I finish my tea and prepare to leave, but I'm in no hurry. These hours belong to the archive, to the quiet work of preservation and attention. And I want to honor that by not rushing, by taking my time, by being fully present until the moment I step out the door. I walk slowly around the room one more time, looking at the shelves full of materials, thinking about all the stories they contain, all the lives and work they document. The Ashford ledgers are complete now, their story told as fully as the records allow. But there are so many other collections here, so many other stories waiting to be discovered and honored. I return to my desk and sit for a few more minutes, simply being present in the space, appreciating the quiet, feeling grateful for this work, and this place. The archive room has become familiar to me over these months. A space where I can focus and think, where the noise and distraction of the ordinary world falls away, and I can engage fully with the materials and their stories. Eventually, I stand and prepare to leave. I turn off my desk lamp and walk to the door, pausing to look back one more time before turning off the overhead lights. The room returns to darkness, and I step into the hallway, locking the door behind me. The building is silent around me as I walk toward the exit. Malcolm is somewhere making his rounds, and I think about waving to him if I see him, thanking him for keeping watch over this place during these quiet hours. But the hallways are empty, and I reach the exit without encountering anyone. Outside, the night air is cool and fresh. The sky is still dark, but there's that subtle sense of approaching dawn, a lightening at the horizon that suggests the night's end. I stand for a moment, looking up at the sky, thinking about the progression of time. About how the daily rhythms continue regardless of the particular stories and lives that unfold within them. I walk to my car and sit for a moment before starting the engine, allowing myself to transition from the interior world of the archive to the exterior world I'm about to enter. The city will be waking soon, beginning another day of activity and noise and movement. But for now, in these quiet moments before dawn, there's still a sense of peace, a connection to the stillness that makes it possible to think clearly and work with attention. I drive home through the empty streets, my mind full of the ledgers I've read, the entries I've documented, the story of Thomas Ashford's printing house that has unfolded over these months of careful work. It's a quiet story, a story of ordinary work done with care and attention, of a business sustained through decades of daily effort, of lives connected through shared labor and purpose. At home, I prepare a light meal and then settle in to rest. I know I'll return to the archive room again tomorrow evening, that there are other collections waiting for attention, other stories to be discovered and honored. But for now, I'm simply grateful for the work I've completed, for the opportunity to spend these months with the Ashford ledgers, for the connections formed across time through the careful reading of someone else's careful records. I fall asleep thinking about Thomas Ashford at his desk, about Peter Whitmore continuing the work, about Margaret Finch setting type and James Holloway running the presses. I think about all the orders completed and delivered, all of the printed materials that went out into the world and served their purposes, all the quiet daily work that sustained the business and the people who depended on it. And I think about my own work in the archive room, about the steady progression through materials that document lives and work from earlier times. It's a privilege to do this work, to serve as a keeper of these records, to help ensure that the careful attention of people like Thomas Ashford isn't forgotten, but preserved and honored and made available for future generations. The night fades toward morning, and I sleep peacefully. My work for now complete. My mind at rest, connected through the quiet labor of reading and documentation to a tradition of care and attention that spans generations and continues into an uncertain but hopeful future.